the world is filled with problems, and God has given us the raw materials to address those solutions with our time, talent, and treasure. And so I just try to apply the things that the Lord has given me to create solutions in areas that I feel like, I'm either called to or I'm competent in.
Well, everyone, hey, this is Lisa Fields. This is our last session for the Through Eyes of Color conference. And as promised, we have Too Woke for Church Part 2. So many of you hit me up asking me about the interview with Sho and how much you love it. It's one of our most watched interviews on YouTube and Facebook. I thought it would be really cool to close out the conference with the conversation with the great artist, Mr. Sho Baraka Lewis. Welcome, Sho.
It's all down here from here. You pumped it up and you were like the most watched, and now it's going to be terrible. So
thank you. It's a song you have about Galatians that really.
Are you trying to come for me right now? I don't appreciate this. I don't appreciate you. All right.
No, but for real, I clown you about the CD, but I really wouldn't have passed my exam on Paul without the 13 letters from 116 helping me.
116. It's 116. Get it right.
So before we even get started, for the people who may not know who you are, that may be living under a rock because you're such a celebrity, let them know who you are.
Well, I've learned that I need to start off by saying I am a husband to a wonderful wife, a father to 3 wonderful children. My name is Sho Baraka, or some people may know me as Sho Baraka. In short, I'm just I'm an artist in the sense that I make music and also act and create film. And soon to be an author, even though I've contributed to other books, but this is, I'll have my first book releasing pretty soon. So, ideator, consultant. I like to call myself a solutionary. I think of, the world is filled with problems, and God has given us the raw materials to address those solutions with our time, talent, and treasure. And so I just try to apply the things that the Lord has given me to create solutions in areas that I feel like, I'm either called to or I'm competent in.
Solutionary. Never heard of that before, but that's dope. Also, you used to be my favorite rapper until I met you. And then I was like, man, this man isn't.
That's why you're never supposed to meet your heroes, cuz. And no, like, he's too humble. He's too humble to be a rapper. I can't rock with humble rappers.
I was just like, man, his shoes don't match his outfits.
You gonna okay? See, you gonna stop clowning my wardrobe game because I stay
with the fashion. With the fashion. Well, let's get to what we're here to talk about. Too Woke for Church Part 2. I think the reason it resonated with people is because they're in this space where they're meeting a lot of people, or they are themselves a person that found themselves waking up to new concepts about their identity and felt disconnected. It was disconnected from what they were hearing in church. But it seems to have evolved since that conversation we had 3 years ago. And I don't know if it's evolved to a place that is healthy at all. What are your thoughts, Mr. Baraka?
Can I first say that I know that, this conversation is somewhat postured in the negative, but I want to say something positive about, because we're gonna have a lot of critiques, but I want to say something positive about what's happened. I think the church and society has been complicit in a lot of ills, socially, physically, financially. I mean, the world is we can easily look in our communities, we can look around the places where churches are closest to, and we can see that there are a lot of problems, right? Christianity on this particular continent has not been the panacea that it should be, especially for people of color. And in a lot of ways, it was used as a tool to subjugate and oppress people. And so the ways in which are the need to castigate it and to scrutinize Christianity and society is so necessary. And so for people to wake up to these particular critiques or these particular ills that are being propagated, I think is amazing. I think it's necessary. And I encourage it. I continually encourage that critique. However, there are particular ideologies and particular results that have been fleshed out that I don't think are healthy for the church, nor do I think it's biblical, right? I think some of the results that people have come to, some of the methods that people use, I think are quite damaging. And I think the Bible actually has answers to how we should address a lot of these issues within society. So I would say, to your question, I would say I would agree. I don't think that I think we're in a much worse place. I don't even remember what year we did that conversation, but I think we're in a worse place now. Not only as how society maybe views racism, but also how society is trying to deal with racism.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about something this morning, and I was thinking about Isaiah and how before he gets to chapter 6, he's talking about the ills in society.
Mm-hmm.
When he gets to chapter 6, he's saying, "Woe is me,
Right.
I am undone." That he realizes that he's a part of the ills in society. And I wonder, though, if we never get to chapter 6, which doesn't give us grace for chapters 1 through 5.
Come on.
We keep talking about the ills of society without ever realizing that we are undone ourselves. Do you think that contributes to it?
That's so we're done. We're done with this conversation because everybody wants justice, right? But nobody wants justice exacted on them, right? Because it's easy for us to look around and to point out the flaws in systems, but oftentimes we don't want to look at ourselves and how we can be complicit. Now, I do think it's important for us to address issues in society, but I think part of the problem with how we address wokeness is this kind of like moral absolution, or how we set up these objectivities or these objective views on our particular ideologies, and we leave no room for nuance. And man, I think when your posture, it lacks humility, when you feel like you're absolutely right about something, you put yourself in the most vulnerable place to perpetuate heinous evils. And I believe that we are in a position where people who believe they're absolutely right, who lack humility, are gonna become the very products that they're trying to fight against.
Mm-hmm. It's almost as if that when I think about who's right or who's wrong, I think about the fact that even the people that start to say, this person is right, that person that they deemed as right, then they say, oh, this person is wrong. So they become the arbiter of right and wrong, and nobody is able to fit in their framework. Yeah. Even the people that they upheld become demonized at a certain point.
Absolutely.
And it's just like, well, and then they'll be like, well, everybody goes to heaven. And I'm like, I don't even think in your framework, you want everyone with you there for eternity, because your scope is so limited. Only you and maybe your friend, if they survive the next 5 years based on your framework, will be people you even want to be around.
Facts. Man, it's a very fragile faith. Like, what I mean? But when you think about this. For the most part, I have friends who have punted the faith because Donald Trump got elected by people who would claim to be Christians or evangelicals. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, if that's the reason why you've abandoned a particular faith, I say your faith and your foundation in Jesus was so fragile. I look at all of my heroes in history, and I can find deep flaws in each one of those individuals. And the moment when we begin to remove the human element from our faith is the moment we don't understand what true faith is. Like, I have to understand that I believe in something that's much greater than me, that accomplishes greater works than I, and I alone, through my human power, cannot accomplish anything apart from the Spirit of the Lord, which is more powerful than anything. And so to recognize that people have flaws and they make flawed decisions is part of the course for Christianity. And yes, that means electing people who are ridiculous, and that means supporting people who are ridiculous. One of my heroes, Alexander Crummell, was the father of Pan-Africanism, right? Was racist against Native Americans, said really heinous things about Native Americans. But that people aren't going to punt Pan-Africanism because of the things that he taught or the things that he believed, because they understand that he held an idea and ideology that was somewhat beneficial, right? Same with King, same with many of our leaders. There are people who are deeply flawed, and the truth that they carry is in broken vessels. And that's what Corinthians talks about. Like, we are fragile, broken people who carry a wonderful truth. And sometimes you can see those cracks. But the treasure that is inside is way more valuable than the vessel. Amen. Come on, somebody. I'm about to preach this thing. But yeah. So, and the other thing is that I know we've kind of talked about this a little bit. What they're abandoning, like, so they abandoned one ship for another flawed ship, right? It's the same thing when I used to tell, like, I used to be an elder at a church, and people would leave our church because they were like, well, I just can't handle this, and I need to go to this church. And I'm like, look, I'm not about trying to keep you at this church, but recognize no matter what church you go to, you're gonna have to deal with sinfulness, because we live in a we're plagued with humanity. Humanity has problems. And until you are able to solve that problem, no matter what church you go to, is going to be an issue. So you have people who are leaving one flawed institution because academia is telling them one thing, right? Academia is a flawed institution as well. And they teach things. It's funny to me how Christians are trying their best to shame the church with people who have no love for the faith that they will hold dear to their heart. And it's like you're partnering with folks who have no love for the church to tear it down. And guess what? The moment you begin to expose yourself for whatever belief you have, they're going to shame you as well. Or you're going to have to, in some ways, deconstruct the things you believe, to your point, to get to a place where you have no real faith and you're just believing anything. And that's no faith at all. And we realize that's not Jesus. Jesus had standards. Jesus had uh, moral, I guess you can say, absolutes that he says that for us to follow. And so, not academia. So anyway, I can ramble on. So I'll let you snatch the mic.
No, I think that's good. But I wonder, because I think we are exposed to so much. And I think traumatized people struggle with reason, right? And I say that we're consuming a lot of information.
Come on.
And I wonder, how does that affect our ability to reason? One of the reasons why we started this conference off with a lecture from Dr. C.J. Rhodes called Philosophy 101, A Reason for Reason, is because I feel like people have lost their ability to reason. Not saying that reason is the end all be all, because
Right,
obviously there's flaws in that.
right.
But emotion has to be balanced with reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're in a culture that is only filtering how we process through our emotions, which is dangerous. And the expectation for the church and Christians is so high.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and everything else is so low. Why do you think the expectations for Christians and the church is so high? And other things get passes.
Well, I think it should be high. So let me say that it should be high. Maybe not as high as we often like indict the church to be a perfect institution, right? So, for instance, you can't name an institution that hasn't practiced some form of oppression and hasn't been on the side of some sort of subjugation. Academia, science has been used, right? When you think about eugenics, when you think about how that practice was used to teach an inferiority of a particular group of people, and which in a lot of ways spawned other practices like slavery and etc. Nobody's going to abandon science. Nobody's abandoning institutions of academia because they feel like, well, that has been used for the subjugation of et cetera, et cetera. Economics has been used for the subjugation of people groups. When you think about redlining, when you think about how the banks took Black people's money and then floundered it or used it for frivolous things, and then turned around and was like, oops, well, but ain't nobody gonna stop trying to make money. Feel me? So there's relationships, right? People fall in love and then fall out of love every day, but nobody's gonna say the institution of relationships or marriages are pointless, right? Well, some people do. For some reason, we do this with religion. We do this with Christianity. We see the flaws in it, and we say, well, because of people's misuse or misappropriation of this particular institution or the teachings, therefore I am done with this thing and I am no longer being a part of it. And I think that's unfair. And I think it's unwise. Hopefully that makes sense in my ramble.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are going to be struck by what you just said.
Yeah, I'm absolutely fine with that. I'm absolutely cool.
I know you are completely fine with that. As you think about nuance and the ways in which we would process that, because we could deal with the stats and the data and policing and all that, but I think that would get us off the topic of too woke for church.
Yeah.
The inability to engage nuance. What do you think? What is some things that have been helpful for you when you're confronted with trauma and reason? What have been helpful tools for you to engage nuance that you think will help our audience?
So one of the practices, not to go back to the previous conversation, but with many things, right? So like within the last 5-6 months, I've been very vigilant about, all right, with this policing thing, like I found myself tweeting and saying things that I was like, man, do I really believe this, right? And I've been rapping about police brutality since 2010. And so this is nothing new to me, right? There are people now who just found out that they were Black and that there's racism, and now they have huge platforms within the Christian space. And like, I'm cool with that because I do think people need to learn and evolve and get to a particular place. As I got to a particular place around 2010, 2011, where people were like, Sho, you need to wake up, right? However, the one thing that I've done in the last 6 months is when I read a book. So for instance, I read The End of Policing, which I think is a great book by Alex Vitale, and it's about basically reforming policing across the board. And I think that's necessary. I think we ask police to do way too much, which causes way too many violent interactions. However, on the other flip side of that, I'll say, you know what, let me read some counter arguments to this. So some academic papers, one by Roland Fryer, another one by Jonathan McWaters, who say, you know what, there's racism in our country, but the way we're talking about policing may be a little bit skewed, right? And I take those two pieces of work and I say, man, how can I build a articulate, intelligent foundation for what I believe when it comes to this particular issue? And so within that, I've come to the point where I'll say, you know what? Yes, there are ways in which where there is a racial animus towards policing Black policing people. But also, I also see that there are ways in which we talk about it, which I don't think are true and are helpful for our community. Policing is a problem in our country in general. I think way too many people are dying. The police get called on way too many circumstances and issues. However, every particular issue is not a racial animus issue. And so for me, I'm like, how do we address this and talk about this issue in a way that I think is honest, but also a way that I think is beneficial to actually create change? And so what I do is I try to get multiple sources on an issue that I think are credible, and I attack the information, and I try to pull out like, all right, I may be wrong. And let me say this, I am perfectly fine with people saying that was a ridiculous thing because I am a learner. And I think that is the part of the problem. I don't come to the table thinking like what I'm saying is absolute facts and true. I come to and I think I'm confident in this. However, change my mind.
Yeah. And I think that is the challenge, right? Because
Yeah.
people think they're real well read. They're only well read on one side. that
Come
go
on.
for the left and the right. And so when you're asking people, I was in a meeting and uh, a guy was saying, "Yeah, I've read on this issue. I've read Thomas Sowell and and other Black
Yeah.
conservatives." And so the other guy was
Right.
like, "But have you read anybody? Have you ever
Right.
read Ta-Nehisi Coates or like have
Bill
you ever?"
Alexander, Angela Davis, but facts. Like, and so yes, absolutely. But then it's even what's funny is even if we take it past like some of the political stuff, one thing I realized because I've done it too, so I'm guilty, and I had to stop doing it. We quote oftentimes we quote people, and and we really don't read them. Like
Mm,
I know so many people who, for instance, will quote Toni Morrison, right, for a particular argument, and I love Toni, and I read a lot of Toni. I don't just read her fiction; I read her essays. I have like 3 books of her essays, and it's fascinating the stuff. And the same thing with Zora Neale Hurston. It's fascinating when you read people's essays, they begin in their biographies, you begin to say, oh, this is kind of like what they believed on this particular issue. I think Baldwin's another one of those individuals. Baldwin gets quoted a lot, but oftentimes he's misquoted or he's quoted in out of context, right? So I think oftentimes we won't just read a book and say, oh, now I'm authority on issues. We quote people who may not have had a particular view on this issue that we thought that they had. Um, so, for instance, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg just died, a couple of days ago, and and I didn't know anything about her. I just knew, obviously, I knew she was Supreme Court Justice, and so I'm gonna read some stuff about her, and then I'll start watching multiple documentaries. And you know what? I realized because she became more liberal as time went on, but in her first couple years within the and even before she became a Supreme Court justice, she has some very conservative views, right? And so when people tweet about her being this, demonic liberal, et cetera, it's like, yo, she's nuanced. She has layers to her. And I think the problem is we don't think about people as being layered and being nuanced. We think of them in categories because we want political polarization.
yeah, and if they do something we don't like, they become demonized.
That's
So the
it.
ability for relationship across denominational lines, across party lines, becomes increasingly hard. There was a Supreme Court justice that I can't think of his name, but he died, and he was extremely conservative.
That's
And
Scalia. Yeah.
and him and Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a great relationship. They were really close,
Mhm.
and the fact that they could coexist with different ideologies is something I think we can learn from because we struggle with that today.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I created Courageous Conversations, to have dialogue, because I believe that the truth often is in the middle. But if you can never have that conversation where you're sharpening each other,
Yeah.
you don't get to see the truth in all this sometimes nuance. And sometimes the truth is not nuanced; it just is what it is.
Facts.
It's
Facts.
just the chips have to fall where they may. You either agree or disagree with that.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think that is the challenge for us today, because we are quick to demonize. And so we get in these unhealthy patterns where we're not able to have relationships. We're not able to interact with institutions on
Mhm.
any level. And I mean, that's I guess extreme of that is a society collapses.
Yeah. Yeah. When, like I said, I think when people get to a place where they feel certain things need to be shut down, there are certain beliefs and ideologies that need to be shut down, and people need to, um, I guess you could say, be canceled. Like, however, I think we're too quick to pull the trigger on canceling people than I think we need to be. Um, I don't I just the Bible, I think, is very clear about humanity's condition. We are depraved people. We are people who had the opportunity to participate in great flourishing in a land that was bountiful, and we desired to colonize it all through our wicked desires, and yet God still granted us grace and favor to be able to get to a place of redemption and reconciliation. And yet, and still, you know, it's funny to me, especially within the Christian space, the amount of the lack of grace that we're willing to offer to people who may say or do some ridiculous things. That doesn't mean just because somebody says something ridiculous, don't mean that we don't call them out. They need to be corrected. And in some ways, people need to be shamed. Shame is something that's good. I do think when people do something utterly ridiculous, for them to feel shame, it will lead them to repentance, hopefully. However, to totally say that someone needs to be canceled or shut up, or like they can no longer participate in the public discourse, or they no longer should get any kind of public support because of something they've done or said, leaves very little grace for them to be repentant and to turn around, right? And then even when people do repent and turn around, we don't receive them in a way that the father receives the prodigal son, right? And we don't celebrate that. It's almost like we thirst and we live for people's demise, especially with social media. It's heartbreaking because as my brother Jono Onwuchekwa makes a statement, he says, man, to get people to stop shooting at one another is a wonderful thing, but ultimately what real love is getting enemies to be family. And I don't see people wanting to be family. I just don't see it. So anyway.
You know what? I think the irony of this is many people don't go to church because the fact that they say they were shamed. So younger people say they were shamed for their sins. If they got pregnant, they were shamed. And they don't buy into the institution because they feel like people weren't gracious to them in their sin and look down upon them. And I think that what you're not healed from, you become.
Yeah.
And I do think when people have these wounds and scars from church or home or different spaces, they become the enemies that they once despised.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I do see that pattern happening to where people say, you know, I didn't like this institution because I didn't feel like they handled my sin properly. Well, when somebody else sins against them or do something they don't like, they have the same posture. Sometimes they can even be harsher than those who did the initial infraction, because unforgiveness usually makes you a repeat offender. Maybe not in the exact same way, but usually that way. And the only way to break that pattern is to forgive.
Yeah. So to in defense, this is the reason why I said earlier that the church there should be greater expectation for the church in some regards, right? Especially for individuals who are shepherding your soul. Grace to me is what Christianity is about: grace and love. People are going to sin. I don't think Christianity is about the avoiding of sin or walking a perfect life. It's about knowing what humanity is and growing closer to God in grace and love. And if we have that as the major tenets of the Christian faith, that we recognize as people violate us, as people violate society, that we challenge them in their sin with the hopes and the expectations that they return. Now, there are certain things that I feel like you handle. There are certain particular shortcomings or sins that people practice that you definitely use more compassion for. Especially if it's a situation like a pregnancy, right? Like, what I think of, people don't deserve harsh, punitive, like some sort of punitive response for things that aren't harming people. You know what I'm saying? When you think about violence, when you think about things that are bringing extreme detriment to our society, yes, in those situations, people need to be like shaken, challenged, and shamed to some degree, with the hopes that they will turn around and we receive them back in grace and love. And there are certain things where people have shortcomings, and we don't use the same kind of gravitas. It's the same gravitas, the same type of heavy-handedness, I guess you can say. However, oftentimes, to change the subject just a little bit, the things in which we think is church hurt or shame is really the Bible. It's just the teaching of scriptures that have offended us, and it's not the church. It's just people
suppressing the truth and unrighteousness.
Absolutely. And so in in a situation like that, I've found so many people who just don't like the laws of God, and the truth of Christ has offended them, and so therefore they leave the church. And I'm like, the reality it is this is one of those situations where the Bible teaches us how to address systematic issues. The Bible teaches us how to reason. The Bible teaches us how to be in line with the gospel and yet still fight for justice. And if you find that the church and the gospel is insufficient in that, then you may have a problem with Jesus and not a problem with your pastor. Now, yes, there are pastors out there who are teaching or are being negligent in how they talk about justice. There are pastors out there who are being an obstacle, and those people need to be corrected and challenged as well. But at the end of the day, the church in its essence is for justice, is for marginalized people. And for us to say that, the Christian faith is not as adequate as some of these academic and sociological ideas, to me is deeply flawed and problem and troublesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is instructive. I think for us to evaluate our hurt and trauma with church,
Yeah,
and start to deconstruct that before we start to try to deconstruct our faith. Because if we could say, okay, what pieces, say you were in the church where the pastor was walling out, okay, then that's something different where you're in the church
yeah,
where they're preaching something that you don't want to align your life to. So then you have to start to separate and deconstruct what your issue is to even be able to speak truth to it. And to see that, like, if your pastor was wilding out, in the scriptures, preachers and priests were wilding out all the time, and God was correcting them through the prophets
right, right.
about their abuse of monetary. So this is not new. So you can tell that God is very much against that. So then you could separate that from what the God that they claim to be representing. And I think it's important for us to do that, to interrogate our own hurt and our own trauma so we can process things as they are, not as our emotions have inflated them to be. Am I making sense?
Yeah, absolutely making sense. And I get it though. Black people have been through some bleep in this country. You know what I'm saying? Like, and it almost feels hopeless, right?
Mhm.
In a lot of ways, I do think a lot of what's being taught and some of these, a lot of these ideologies is nihilism. It's a black pessimism. And
Sucks away your hope.
say that
That's
one
the
more time.
thing. It sucks away your hope.
No, there is no hope, right? There's
Yeah.
and I think that is that is obtuse from what the Bible teaches us. First of all, it's antithetical uh to what the Bible teaches, but it's also obtuse to what we've seen and actually witnessed in Black theological history in this country. We've seen people live through much worse times than we live in right now. And guess what? They had the greatest of hopes in the gospel. They had the greatest of hopes in Jesus. They sang about it. That's how we got Negro spirituals. Think about James Weldon Johnson's poetry, wrote about it. Think about the dancing, how you take cakewalking. Cakewalking, you take the shame of of slavery and you turn it into something, right? Where we got soul train lines from. You think like like you get, that's where you get the Harriet Tubmans. That's where you get the Sojourner Truths. This is where our theological history comes from people who had the audacity to hope in the darkest of times. And I can't believe that we're taking on these ideologies, the theologies of pessimism and nihilism, and promoting this lack of hope as if there is no redemption and reconciliation. Every day we hope to be reconciled with people we love. I wake up every day and I'm like, man, hopefully me and my wife will love each other today. We have problems in our marriage, and then we wake up and say, let's work on it. Because we have hope that our marriage will last and that it will restore us to our dying day. And in the same way, I hope that we have hope in our relationships with one another across race, across culture, across class as well. That's another thing we're not talking about. Is the class issues that we have within society, and even some of the privilege that academia has in trying to tell people how to think and how to process information in situations, when a lot of the Black community is like, nah, I don't know if I rock with that. You know what I'm saying? So there's a lot of nuance, and I can't use the word nuance. If we were playing a drinking game, we both be drunk right now. How many times nuance has been used?
But you know, you're right. I tell this story. Me and my friend were having brunch, and you know, DC bougie brunch. Like us, I consider people say I operate in the bougie space. You know, I don't. I'd say I have preferences. But anyway,
accepted. I'm all the way bougie.
Yeah,
I like the Lord saved me, but I'm still bougie.
Yeah. So, you know, so we're waxing eloquently about the ills of the world and the how we need to fight for justice and the marginalized. And he was completely passionate about it. So we get outside and a homeless man asks for some money. And I'm like, man, I don't have anything. You know, I really don't carry cash. And I said, do you have something? He's like, I don't give homeless people money. They probably gonna use it for something else. And it struck me in that moment. I was like, that is the Black elite.
Yeah.
Always waxing eloquently about the ills of society, but don't necessarily want to be around the marginalized. Help the marginalized with the words. Get on CNN and commentate about the marginalized. Write books about the marginalized. But you ain't gonna see us hanging with the marginalized on the
Yeah. It's funny how a lot of these academics, they, you know, I don't want to call out this one particular person, talks about Black injustice and Black this and Black that, and it was asked, why don't you teach at a Black institution? Because there are many of Black institutions that can use your intelligence and your presence, right? And he's like, well, they don't pay enough. And I'm like, well, ain't that capitalism? And I'm like, we talk about injustice and people look, oh, there should be no such thing as billionaires and et cetera, et cetera. But how many of y'all are gonna stop using Amazon to get y'all stuff? You know what I mean? This is the kind of things, this is why I think a lot of our conversation around justice is just totally situational. It's situational ethical. It's like, what's ethical for me, it should be ethical for everybody else. However, when we apply it or take it to its furthest end, it does not hold weight. And I think this is where the Bible communicates truth. It's like, what does the Bible say about these issues? And it's not just good for my soul, it's good for society. And oftentimes the things that we want to push and promote aren't really good for society. It's just good for our own self-consciousness or it's good for our particular class of people. And so I don't know, man. We
want to be prophets to the people outside of our doors, but don't want to be a prophet to the person in our mirror. And that's the going back to the Isaiah 1-5, but we never get to Isaiah 6. So woe is me. We don't see ourselves as a part of the problem. We see ourselves as fixers of the problem.
Yeah.
And when we see ourselves as fixers, we see ourselves as saviors, not someone in need of a savior. And I think that's where we are. We're like, we don't need God. We don't need church. We don't need religion. We are the solution. Without realizing that we also are the problem.
Amen. Amen.
Is there anything you want to add to this conversation? I think it's been rich, and I love the point you brought out, especially about hope, because I think that is the only way in which we survive these times is to have hope in an unshakable, unchanging God.
Well,
And
let me ask you. Let me ask you. How, you are as alert or as keen to the zeitgeist of the day as anybody is. What are your thoughts? First, let me say this: praise God for you and what you guys do, and Jude 3 Project. And I think this is you are a jewel and a treasure to our church and to our community.
thank you,
But
Sho.
to go back to the question, what do you think? Are you hopeful? Do you think we're in a time that, especially with the election coming up, racial discourse being extremely unhealthy, the need for justice, the need for reform, afoot. However, the postures of people, like, how do you feel? Like, what is your pulse on things?
So that I think that's a really good question. I've seen all the scrolling on social. You see, and I really
Let me add something to this, especially in context of the Black church and kind of like the Black traditional church, Black evangelicalism, and kind of like the woke Black crowd. Those three little categories. What are your thoughts?
um so one, I say scrolling on social, I realize that people, even though they're anti American capitalism, their hope is very much in the American system.
Mm.
And I started to notice this recently when I was seeing more of my progressive friends when things would happen in government, they'd be like, I'm crying or I'm physically shaken. And I'm like, did you think they were really going to save us?
Facts.
And I think people have put their hope in systems they don't even believe in.
Yeah,
And
but I don't fault them, no. But I want you to finish. This is my thing. I don't have hope in the American system as well. However, I I do have. It's funny. Like, I said this at a talk recently. It amazes me that I do think if Black people are waiting for some majestic allyship from white people, then we'll be waiting for another century, or we'll be having this conversation another century from now. I do think our attention needs to turn away from this idea of trying to solve white supremacy to more towards Black empowerment.
mhm.
I think that's, and sometimes those things are one and the same. However, I don't think it's always one and the same. I think you can achieve Black empowerment, which I've seen many people do, which I think I do myself, which I've seen communities of, we've seen communities in history do it without us depending on one, white allyship, or always having our attention on white supremacy and trying to figure out how white supremacy is either an obstacle for us or some sort of thing for us to solve, which I don't know if we'll solve it. And I'll say this real quick. That to me means not just focusing on political change, right? Because I do think political change is quite important. Political capital and power is quite important, but I think it also means trying to turn our attention towards human and social capital. Like, how do we get people better jobs within our community, create better institutions within our community, and start supporting people and institutions in our community, rather trying to figure out how to get to some white table or deconstruct some white idea. And we've seen Black people thrive within this society and this system. And so the best way, to me, and I know people have said, have diverse opinions on this, I believe that the best way to thrive is to see the system for what it is and try to figure out how to use it for our benefit while doing it in a benevolent way that's not trampling over people. Now, I know I wanted you to answer the question and I just hijacked you. That was my male privilege, I guess, my patriarchy. And I apologize. So
No, you're fine. But I do think, when I say, did you believe the American system was going to save you? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have hope in the, in the progression of the system or the American ideal. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that as believers, I think we have put too much weight on
Mhm.
the American idea, and not enough weight on the God we serve.
Come on. Uh-huh. Amen.
So I think we have an imbalance there. So our disappointment goes up to, I wonder, have we really bought into the God we serve or we claim to serve?
Mm.
And as I see people rattled and shaken, it is almost as if like, not saying like, oh my God, we all were shaken when Trump got elected. So I'm not saying that,
Right. Right.
but I'm saying that to their core, as if life is over and they might as well just lay down and die. And I'm
Yeah.
like, for that reaction seems to be a bit much
Yeah.
if you claim to be a believer in God.
Yeah.
Not saying that you can't be shaken or concerned, but I'm like, to your core, like we don't got no hope. Like
Yeah.
there's
Right.
a God of the universe that you bought in to. This is it.
Yeah.
And I've just been, challenging people like, this is not our home. This is not it. There is life after this. And justice won't bring you the healing that you think it will.
Yeah. Right.
That's
But it don't make life better. But you're
Yeah,
right.
this is a part of
It
healing.
it
But
won't
just
solve the problems. It won't
Yeah,
solve the problems. Yeah.
it's
But
not.
I'll say this. I'll take a check. I'll take a reparations check. But that don't mean that it's gonna make my life that much better. But I'll take that check though.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely. We fight, and I don't want anybody to say, "Oh, I'm just saying we don't fight for justice or reparations," all of those things.
Yeah.
But I'm saying we fight for those things also in the proper perspective of knowing that it won't save our souls or heal us from the trauma. So
Yeah.
think about a person.
Yeah. That's good.
If your parent was killed, you getting justice and that person going to prison doesn't replace that parent or heals the pain of that parent's
Yeah.
absence.
Yeah.
And so I think it is a part. Getting justice is a part, because you don't want to see that. You want justice.
Yeah.
But think about, if all my hope is in justice here, and I think about all the people who don't get justice here, I would be really hopeless if this was all that there was. Think about our ancestors that were lynched,
Yeah.
the injustices, that were raped, murdered, slaughtered, and they didn't get the murderers got away scot-free. If this is all there is, and that is a hopeless state. I have
Yeah.
to trust
Yeah.
that God is a just God, and
Amen.
that He will give judgment to those who did wrong to my ancestors. You know what I'm
Yes.
saying?
And not only that God is a just. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I thought you were done.
So
Go
you
ahead. And I said not only that God is a just God, but that He's a forgiving God and He's a gracious God. Because oftentimes we never see ourselves as part of the problem.
Mm.
And within racism, no, we're I would say yeah, but there are other situations when we think about. So I'm one. I would consider myself somewhat well traveled, but I also participate, or I'm on the board of an organization that does a lot of overseas advocacy when it comes to environmental justice. The things that the way that America contributes to the pollution around the world is somewhat devastating. And we think about the consumerism within this country. We think about the way we waste stuff. We think about even some of the practices and habits we have. We create poverty in other countries. And so if we're talking about the type of justice that we want, oh, we want justice now, then we are complicit in some of that poverty overseas. We're complicit in some of the poverty a couple communities over.
And to your point, because in America, we see like COVID is very problematic for us. But I
Right.
was thinking about it. There are countries, especially on the motherland, that live, this is their life,
Yeah.
to live under a pandemic all the time. And it's like, for us, we think it's the end of the world. No, it's
Yeah.
just a discomfort to us. But
Yeah.
the rest
Right.
of
Right.
the world is living with this kind of discomfort for most of the time. And it's
Yeah.
like when it becomes us, then it's the end of the world. When people have it so much worse, and this has been their reality since they've been born. So
Yeah. And that's what it is. We just need to be sober minded. I think that's at the end of the day, my goal, my thought is just how are we centered? How are we people who are centered and sober minded?
so as we close, to Woke for Church, I think we've been all over in this conversation, but we were all over in the last conversation. I think that's why people liked it.
Yeah.
As people are really struggling, kind of trying to decolonize their faith and
Mm.
wanting to separate it from white supremacy
Yeah.
completely, what advice would you give them as your closing thoughts for them?
I would say the first thing is to understand that you're in a good space because many of people have come to this place where they've recognized, like, what do I believe? Why do I believe? And who's informed of my belief system? And there have been some terrible short stories that have shaped my identity. And I want to get to a place where the person who I am, who God made me, is dignified through scriptures and through a litany of theologians and activists who share the same belief system that I have. My encouragement would be is to read those people, is to search those people. If there is a theology out there that is not attached to justice, then that theology and that gospel is anemic. When I think about Black theological history, um, it is a gospel message that is tied to the idea of justice. And there's a lot of writing out there. There's a lot of history out there for us to engage. And around 2010, 2011 is when I started to say, you know what? For if my lexicon, if my library is just full of white Calvinists and reformers, I am missing out on a just a world of wisdom. And I began to just explore orthodoxy in Ethiopia, orthodoxy in North Africa. I started to explore theologians in history. Is where I found so many people like the Richard Allens and the Francis Grimke's and the Lemuel Hayneses, and I found all these wonderful books, Anna Julia Cooper's, the Jarena Lee's, and guess what? These folks aren't being celebrated in seminaries, right? Maybe in certain African American seminaries they are, but most predominant seminaries aren't teaching them about these people or teaching them about the theological history that was tied to justice. And I would say find those folks. There are great books out there. I know an individual who we both admire, Vince Bantu, Dr. Vince Bantu, just recently wrote a book. And I think there are resources out there, resources that you guys give at Jude 3 that I think will be beneficial for those folks out there. But and all of that, as you research, as you get more information, as you get more centered in this context of Black theological thought, grow in wisdom, grow in love, grow in grace. If wisdom is not teaching you to love better, then it's demonic. It's not helpful. You know what I mean? I am very adamant that the information we obtain should make us wiser and make us people who love God more and love our neighbor more. The whole posture of the folks from Richard Allen to the Thomas Skinners are was for us to, one, have an identity that is centered in the Imago Dei, but also to see our brothers and sisters as individuals who are also created in the image of God. And if we can't love people, no matter who they are, then we have a problem with our theology. And I won't apologize for saying that I think that we are to love our neighbor and to be reconciled to people, even in the most ridiculous of countries like America. So um, the hope is in the gospel, and my hope is in God, redemption of all things, our personal relationship with God, our relationship with one another, and the systems that we've created.
Dope. That's super helpful. And I love when you were talking about wisdom. I always ask God for wisdom since I've been a child, and I heard the story of Solomon, and I used to pray. I learned the story of Solomon in Sunday school, or it might have been through a church service. And ever since I was a kid, I prayed for God to give me wisdom. And then I heard the story of Solomon falling, and I used to pray, God, give me wisdom, but help me to have the wisdom and to apply it.
Come on.
And not be like Solomon and not end up like him. But I've been thinking a lot about Solomon's son, Rehoboam, and when he got the kingdom and when he took the advice of his peers versus the advice of the elders, and how the advice of his peers caused the kingdom to split and him to lose the majority of the kingdom of Israel. And I thought about how in our generation, we're only listening to people our age or in the same life chapter as us, and how much we lose by not engaging the elders and getting wisdom from those who are older. And so I love that you brought in wisdom, and also the ability to hear from those who have been through things. Because oftentimes when we listen to our peers, and people in the same space, we think that this life chapter is all there is. But people who have been through life are able to say, no, I understand this feels like this, or this decision seems like right based on your own perspective or vantage point. But if you're looking at the whole scope and how this is going to impact the next part of your life, you'll see things differently. And I think our propensity to maybe only go to church with people our age, versus doing life with people in other life chapters also hinders us from progression. I know that was a tangent, but
it was good. That was good. And actually, I wish I would have said that, because I do think another element to this whole conversation is too woke for church is you need community. You need people. You need, I'm not saying go to the traditional church gathering, but I do think you need some sort of context where people are gathering and there are people who are speaking to your soul, and you guys are in this mutual edification process where we're growing together in the scriptures, not just having conversations about sports, not just having conversations about racism, not just having conversations about how broken this world is, but like literally are coming together in the mutual edification of the scriptures to one another's soul. And I realized that in times recently, I've kind of church hopped in the last year, and I realized how it's been a detriment to my soul. Honestly, like how I am hurting because I don't have a legitimate church home, and I'm not submitted unto any particular group of elders. And then this pandemic hits, and it's even worse, right? Because you can't gather anymore, and I'm doing church over the internet, and it's taught us the need for community and the need to be with people. It is not only necessary in the theoretical, but it is good for our bodies. It is good for our soul. There are studies out there that people who live in good communities live longer, right? And so this is like, and I say community not in the sense of like buildings. I'm talking about like when there's a healthy social community, they have better health. So anyway, I know I'm be rambling, but thank you for catalyzing that thought I had and saying that.
Thank you, Sho. This has been great, y'all. I hope y'all enjoyed our conversation, Too Woke for Church Part 2. Thank you, Sho Baraka, for your wisdom, your insight, and for your fashions. No scarf today, but I really appreciate you.
Hey, first of all, can I get a shameless plug for this brand, Good Culture? Soon to drop, you know what I'm saying? Soon to drop.
Okay, you got new merch? All right.
New merchandise, and your boy stay fresh.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been Too Woke for Church, further through Eyes of Color, virtual experience. God bless.